All right. Welcome back to the Leaderful podcast. My name is Jeff Couillard. I'm the co CEO and Director of Learning and Development here at the Ally Co. I'm going solo today. My partner in crime, Pablo, is off on vacation with his family, a much deserved vacation. And so I thought I would record a short discussion really about the difference between power, authority, and influence. It was a topic that emerged actually on LinkedIn. I posted something about kind of pushing back a little bit on the notion that we should be looking to build trauma-informed workplaces. I think that that's quite a bit of a stretch, and that's probably a different episode. We should probably bring on a trauma expert to talk about that. I was advocating for power awareness, and in the comment thread, which got quite lengthy, there were people saying we should not use the word power. We should use the word influence or authority or some other synonym for power. And I actually don't agree with that. I don't think that that's what we should do. I don't think we should replace power. I think we should maybe rehabilitate power. If it's something that you have a negative association with, if you hear the word power and you automatically think of the negative and the misuses and abuses of power, I think that that's an opportunity for us to rehabilitate that, to think about power as maybe neutral, as a force in the world that can be used for good and for bad. But we lose a lot when we decide not to call it a thing what it is, and in this case, power as the underlying force in all of our relationships. I think it's actually really important for us to name that and to be with that and to talk about the differences between that and some of the other words that we might choose. And so, if you're watching this, there's some short clips on YouTube between power, authority, and influence. If you're listening to this, I've got some slides up. Not essential that you have the slides in front of you because I'm going to talk it through. So let's actually start with a definition of power. And this is an adapted definition from the Right Use of Power Institute, which we lean on their framework and their model quite heavily in the leadership development work that we do. But power as the ability to affect or prevent change. That's it. Power is inherently a neutral force. It's pervasive, right? It's everywhere. I don't have a relationship with another human being that doesn't have a power dynamic associated with it. And that makes it quite predictable. And so, neutral, pervasive, and predictable, we should actually be able to be proactive with our use of power. We should be able to see power playing itself out in relationship and maybe even thinking ahead of time that, hey, I should be able to predict that this thing might happen if I use power in this way, or if this type of power is present. And we'll talk about the different types of power probably on a different podcast. All right, so that's power. That's the definition of power. Now, when we think about authority, what's the difference between power and authority? So I went to, of course, to the internet to look for a definition, and this is a definition of authority: the power or right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. Right. So when I think of that definition, and when I think of authority versus power, I think of authority as kind of a specific type of power, and it's a power over other people. And it's probably based in a role that we have, right? A position that we hold, right? So authority and positional power or role power are probably closer to synonyms for me. So I see authority as a type of power, but not power itself, right? It's role again or knowledge based. You can be an authority, be an expert on something based on the knowledge that you hold. So we might also consider it as expertise, right? But the distinction for me between power and authority again is that authority is probably just a type of power, one of the 5 types of power. Okay, influence, on the other hand, back to the definition on the internet, as the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something in indirect or intangible ways. And so, some key pieces there: that influence is indirect, right? We put things out into the world, suggestions, right? And it might influence someone. Advertising is a great example of influence, right? Is there power to the Super Bowl ad, right? That people pay millions of dollars for, right? Probably it influences buyer behavior, but in an indirect way. It's suggestive that you might want to do this thing or do that thing or not do something, right? So it's more swaying or moving something, and it can be really challenging to pin down, right? It can be challenging to say this is the thing that had the effect, right? Because it can be a lot of different touch points when it comes to influence, and it can happen over time. Okay. So why we can't say that power and influence are synonyms, right, is because we wouldn't say, for example, right now it's fall 2022, and we're watching as large tech companies are laying off, thousands of people, a lot of their workforce. Twitter apparently just laid off half of their workforce after Elon Musk took over. And we wouldn't say that Elon Musk influenced that firing, right? It was directly caused by people in a position of power. And so influence doesn't quite cut it. It can't quite be a full replacement for power as an idea or power as a concept. So when I think about influence, I think about that's a way in which power is used, right? And we can use power in different ways, right? Influence is that indirect attempting to sway or, not to try and use the same word to define it, but influence something, right? In indirect or intangible ways, right? So it's a way in which we use power. Authority is probably a type of power, but neither are power themselves. And actually, we're only about 5 minutes in, so why don't we talk about the 5 types of power, and we'll make this episode just a touch longer. Right. And so again, this is work there are concepts that are based in the right use of power framework based on the work of Dr. Cedar Barstow and the Right Use of Power Institute. I happen to be the board chair of the Right Use of Power Institute currently, as well as one of the advanced trainers in the model. And so, I spend a lot of time thinking about and reflecting on power in the world and power in our organizations. And there's 5 different types of power in the model, right? And we're going to walk through it. And so the first type of power is this idea of personal power. And personal power is the ability to affect change or prevent change that's rooted in who you are as a person. And so I have personal power. It gets me up in the morning and it motivates me. There might be some qualities that you'd think that Jeff is powerful because he can X, Y, or Z. He can communicate clearly, or he can get himself up and go for a run. I know lots of people who are very personally powerful, right? My friend Vince runs ultra marathons, right? And so that in that realm of life, he's got a lot of personal power. Okay. The difference between personal power and role power is that role power, again, is based in this idea of being in a position, right? And so right now, I'm in the role of being the podcast host, and you're in the role of being the podcast listener. When I'm facilitating a session with one of our clients on conscious communication or the right use of power, right, I'm in the facilitator role, and they're in a participant role. And with that role comes different definitions of and expectations of what power looks like, how it can be used, what the expectations are, what the outcomes are of that relationship. We have that positionality that starts to form when we have a role. Right. And it's actually very helpful to have roles. My wife is a teacher, and in her role as a teacher, she has certain expectations that she's held to about what it is she should be using her power to accomplish, which is the learning, growth, and development of the students. Right. Without that role power, we wouldn't have a student teacher relationship. And it's the same as, a doctor patient or lawyer client. Roles help us exercise specific authority or expertise in the service of that relationship. Okay. The third type of power is this idea of status power. And status power can best be thought of as membership. And these are memberships that we hold in different groups in society that themselves carry power. Okay. And so, as an example, I'm a male, right? I'm a man, I'm a middle-aged man. I speak English, right? I'm white or Caucasian, right? That set of memberships gives me quite a bit of power in society. Right. And so we start to see this power and privilege conversation. This is really a status conversation. Am I belonging to a group? Do I have membership in a group that has power in society? Okay. The fourth type of power, as we continue to move out from this idea of personal power, we have collective power. And this is the power of organizations and institutions, both formal and informal, that create power. And we can see this play itself out in politics, right? So we'll have different political parties that you might kind of lean one way or another, right? And membership in that collective gives you power. Not necessarily a status, although sometimes I think we can confuse the two, or there is some intersectionality there or crossover between collective membership in a collective organization versus status. But how I see collective is really, it's about a group of people focused around the same vision, mission, and values. Right? We care about the same things, and so we become a part of a collective. And it's through being a part of that collective that we have leverage, right, to affect change again in the world. Okay? All of this, of course, is nested within the idea of systemic or structural power, right? And these are the stories and the structures and the symbols that exist in our world that create the conditions in which all of these other types of power are possible. Right. And so some examples of systemic power, might be colonialism, might be capitalism, might be, democracy as a political system. When we start to look at the systems, our educational structures and systems of, a K to 12 education followed by post-secondary, right? Those structures, right, have embedded within them these myths and these stories about what it means to be successful, for example, would be a story that's part of the structure in which you and I find ourselves in every day. right? And that influences all the different layers of power. Okay. And so, as you can see, the reason why I probably have an allergic reaction to the idea of replacing power with something like authority or influence or any other synonym that someone might suggest is that we lose the nuance of these different types of power. We lose the up and down power dynamic. We lose the shadow side of power. We use the positive sides of power when we try and replace it as opposed to rehabilitate it. And so that was the goal. A little bit of today's podcast was to rehabilitate power in your mind. If you're someone who looks at it and only sees the misuses and abuses of power and has a bit of a negative reaction to the idea of power, that you can look at it as more nuanced, as a neutral phenomenon in the world, and as something that we can learn more about and dig into and leverage in ways that are helpful and accomplish the things that we want to accomplish as individuals, but also as part of the broader collective, the organizations, the teams, and the institutions that we're a part of. So thank you again for listening to the Leaderful Podcast. If you've been enjoying these, we would love a rating or a review on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or somewhere else. It helps us reach more people and have a bigger impact in the world, which is something that we're really hoping to do. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.